and thanks everybody for joining this session. I'm sorry that I was involved in changing the scenery just now, but I like to be useful. So we're going to look at how manufacturing technologies, smart manufacturing, and a smart supply chain are changing global trade. You've heard a lot about the threats and opportunities that there are in a changing supply chain. And we published this a little while ago. We reproduced it. It's from Stanford Institute, and it's a global uncertainty index. I'm sure it's way off the scale now. But the point is, it looked at, I would say, it looked at macroeconomic factors, it looked at trade war, it looked at things like that, looked at energy crisis. What it didn't really do, it didn't think about demand. And the real challenge in supply chain, my life in this, has been everybody thinks about the bottlenecks, the constraints, the containers, the ships that are not unloaded, but they don't think about the fact that most supply chain problems are because demand is difficult to anticipate. It's interesting that we saw this first perhaps with the pandemic. Was there a shortage of things? Yes, but actually demand went up because people immediately wanted to buy milk powder, rice, pasta, things that they could store. And, well, we weren't able to anticipate that. So an awful lot is about really trying to anticipate what's happening with demand. And interestingly, even before the pandemic, there was a lot of changes going on with demand. New data that's available has helped people to create new products which take off more quickly. It's enabled people to create new channels and new ways of serving people. And I'd say that the other thing really around this is that when we published this, we were looking at how can you really insure yourself against that? And yes, you can have some strategic inventory, but we looked at people using options. Now, people have used options for years in the supply chain as a hedge against, risk of supply, but also the risk that your demand either tanks or really takes off. If you look at somebody like HP, they have absolutely no idea which gizmo is going to take off or not. Do they contract for all the fabricators who are going to make it for them offshore? No, they have options. And it's the same thing with oil or energy. And the other thing that we're seeing is that governments are getting very heavily involved in creating, I'd say, new regulations around this. So one, for example, that you might know about is the European Chips Act, that really tried to guarantee that Europe would have more self-sufficiency around semiconductors. Another really important piece of legislation that's coming in is an extension to existing legislation. You've probably heard of this, the Lieferkettengesetz. It's coming in 2023. It applies to any business that's trading at all in Germany, selling or buying in Germany, and it applies to the entire global supply chain. And your treatment of employees in your extended supply chain could be 29 different levels of your bill of material. Your treatment of the employees and the treatment of the environment must be as good as it would be if it was onshore in Germany. So that's a really big challenge to try and restructure that supply chain. And we're beginning to see some technologies like additive manufacturing come to the rescue. So this is a small company in Switzerland that does it prints circuits, and it prints them using 3D printing. It's getting very close to the point where maybe this kind of technology will make us less reliant on those huge silicon chip foundries that take 4 billion euros to create and take years to bring online. Once we have that, then we'll see more elasticity in the supply of electronics that we use in absolutely everything. So yes, people are using options, but the other thing we know, and this is from Supply Chain Media, we know they did this survey just earlier this year. We know that European and US companies are reshoring some activities. Why are they doing that? It's exactly really as we heard earlier, it's about the balance between what's really asset intensive and what's manual intensive. And the modern economy is becoming more and more and more asset intensive. So you can see this even in companies that have begun this onshoring. So if you look at somebody like Stanley Black & Decker across the world, so in Europe, but also in the US, one of the things that they've adopted is a policy of make where you sell and buy where you make. Why make where you sell? Because the markets themselves are changing so quickly. You saw the number of new products. You saw the new types of ways of serving people. Nobody actually wants to buy a generic drill. What they really want to do is to have the services of that drill for a particular project. If you're going to get close to your customers, you need to make and service them where they are. And it means that you need to start to rethink that supply chain from making a lot of commoditized and not particularly attractive products to making something that's really specific for a really local market. And how are people doing that? They're investing in automated manufacturing, they're investing in automated distribution centers, and governments, as I said, playing a big part in this. So Intel is investing in huge chip plants in Europe now. They've been given, I think, quite a lot of incentives to do that, but nonetheless, that's part of onshoring that chip manufacturing. Now, I talked about the hardest problem is really anticipating demand. And what's made it harder still is the fact that we're now serving, as manufacturers, as distributors, as retailers, we're serving multiple different channels. And those channels have different levels of urgency. So some of them just won't wait for something to be on a ship for a long while. And to anticipate that, we also have to understand something about the real-time status of demand. When I was a youngster, when I first finished my operations research study, I used to do what we now call supply network optimization. So I used to calculate the center of gravity, in this case for consumer goods, and I used to lease trucks and warehouses for 3 years. This little graphic here, it's one that we borrowed from a consulting company that shows the center of gravity of demand moving around all the time. Why is it moving around? Because you've got different types of people in different channels, and you've got different products and many new products that they're buying. And that moving around of that demand is one of the things that I'd say companies like Amazon understand very well. You've heard Amazon say that its supply chain success is because of anticipatory shipping. What do they mean? People are going on Amazon first and looking for things. They know where the purple ones should be. They know where the frilly ones should be. They know where the multi-button ones should be. And they're moving around their supply chain in order to meet that anticipated demand. And of course now we've got also on-demand transportation, we've got on-demand storage as well, and all those play a part. So if you look at consumer goods, the rise in direct-to-consumer is compounding the complexity of what they have to deal with. They now have, instead of just shipping to a DC and the retailer manages it to the store, they've got to think about which types of customers and when are they going to be buying this and where should they be supplying. It's one of the things that's driven a huge interest in sensors for this real-time visibility that I talked about. And real-time visibility has already transformed some aspects of transportation. So we heard a little bit earlier on about the idea of not committing yourself to a single partner. And we've seen now people putting together supply networks of multiple partners and brokering that demand, perhaps right across the world for you. And real-time visibility has helped with that, but so has the cloud, and so has artificial intelligence to enable the supply network to know which carriers are going to be most involved in this. So we've seen that, but visibility alone is not solving the problem. Why do I say that? I talk to an awful lot of people in transportation who say, the reason why we can't retain our drivers, they only earn when they're driving. They turn up to places where we sent an ASN in advance, where they've been given a slot on a day and perhaps a particular hour. They turn up on time, nobody's ready for them. They had visibility. What they didn't have was the capability to plan what they were doing in that DC or that warehouse. And on a macro scale, we see it all over the world in ports. So do we know when the vessels are arriving? Of course we do. There aren't sea monsters or pirates hijacking them. They run on a regular schedule. What we don't have is the ability to plan all the assets. We've talked a little bit about this, about the idea of digitizing the assets, digitizing the ports, the cranes, perhaps having IoT or something like that involved in this. And we've seen, in fact, every container has an OCR code, which tells you what it is and can track to what's in it. And we've seen very smart digitized ports like Hamburg that have IoT built into the whole platform so that they call the trucks for the particular containers when they're ready for them. So it's not just visibility. You need to be able to master agility at scale. And at the moment, the complexity that we have, people have talked a lot about complexity of the supply chain, the multiple tiers and the layers. It really doesn't work for a single enterprise to have a kind of control tower approach and to tell everybody else what to do. One of the biggest complaints I get is from companies in tiered supply chains like automotive or aerospace, where the OEM dictates to them exactly what they've got to supply and when. They create a forecast, for example, of how many drivetrains they need for SUVs and how many they need for compact vehicles. If the forecast is wrong, it's hard luck for the tier one supplier. They've already supplied this stuff and they put it in the manufacturing facility of the OEM. They don't get paid for it till it gets used. So many of them complain about, I'd say, a double layer of opacity or opaqueness. Both understanding what the real demand is, further down at the component or even the raw material layer, and further up, understanding what real capacity and real response might be from your supply chain partners. And this kind of top-down control tower approach, people have invested lots in it. We've seen lots of people say they're disappointed. Why are they disappointed? Because it's not pooling, it's not really collaborative, as people have already said. What do they want to do? They want to build in resilience by pooling an understanding of demand. Can we do this? We've got lots of different demand signals. We've done it at the enterprise level. Everybody has some kind of sales and operations planning process. What does that do? It synchronizes what sales expects with what transportation and manufacturing capacity we have and with our financial plan. Well, what people want to do now is to do that not just at the enterprise level, but at a multi-enterprise level. So to synchronize their understanding of demand, to share some aspects of available to promise and capable to promise, and also to be able to identify and authenticate their partners. So people tell us what they're looking for is a kind of like a LinkedIn, really, of supply chain. So they can invite their customers and their suppliers onto a platform, and they can choose what they share and with whom in a controlled way. And when they do that, they can start to collaboratively sense and respond to changes. And we see this kind of thing integrating planning and execution across all the different planning and execution horizons, so from days or even hours, weeks, months, and years, and for each type of role. Now, to do that kind of thing, you've got to think about the supply chain horizons, but you've also got to think about some kind of smart technology. So we've been looking at smart manufacturing to improve the agility of manufacturing facilities. And you can see the kind of thing that people are investing in. They're investing in, yes, edge computing to sense, but also to response, to manage the operations. People often say to me, does that just mean manufacturing execution? Not really, no. It's not just about counting what we're doing. It's about counting, and it's about making recommendations and sometimes directly controlling the equipment for resetting it. So we see that inside manufacturing, but we see the same thing inside the supply chain as well. Notice people investing in demand signal repository. Notice them investing in modeling. So what they're really trying to do is, just as you model a factory, and you've heard people talking about a digital twin of a factory, so you know what the changeover time is for each work center or each machine. You know what the run rate is. You know what your loading is from time to time. And when you get a rush order, you can reorganize around that. But the same thing is happening in supply chain. So you know what it takes to set up a supply chain, you know what its capacity is. And one of our clients said to me, they said, in this new world, every customer is special. We need to segment the supply chain. Some customers need it very urgently, some not so much. Some we need to onshore, some we need to nearshore, some we're going to perhaps, serve from a distant manufacturing facility offshore. Another one, after we just had this discussion, said, but actually, George, it's not just the customer that's special, it's each order that's special. And that's why we need to be able to spin up a supply chain actually for each order. And when you look at people who are working on intelligent orders, they're doing that. They're balancing the urgency of the demand, the landed cost, and the quality and the service that their customers expect. So they're building a model just as they built a digital twin of the factory, they're building a digital twin of their supply chain. It's a digital twin of the market. It's also a digital twin of their ability to fulfill. And some things around this, we've seen lots of changes in procurement. People have talked already a little bit about this. We've talked about the fact that supplier risk becomes strategic, your understanding of the carbon footprint of that supplier and their treatment of their labor is incredibly important. But part of that's the kind of risk side of it. On the other side, what we're seeing is innovation ecosystems are replacing those cost-optimized supply chains. So people often say to me, when I talk about building this digital twin, won't you have to get a lot of data from your partners? Yeah, and those are the partners who will help us in building this innovation ecosystem. And particularly in asset-intensive industries, it's not really about the cheapness of labor anymore. It's not the labor rate that's really dominant. It's much more, how will you be the best supplier that will help me in this innovation ecosystem and in working with me together with other suppliers and for our common customers to meet their complex requirement. How will we release people to do this? Because, well, procurement people are pretty much flat out now. If you've ever been in any kind of supply chain, particularly transportation office, there are people doing a lot of busy work. There's a lot of telephones and spreadsheets. By the way, it's the same thing in production planning. What will help to replace that? There'll be a lot more self-service for buyers outside procurement. So we won't necessarily have to route everything directly through procurement. We'll have rules, we'll have systems that help them to do that. And we'll embed algorithms. And as people have already talked, we'll exploit a massive data out there with new technology. And we're going to embed, of course, supplier risk and performance value. One of the things that we do is to produce tools like this. So we look at the market, and we're doing it right now for supply networks. We segment it into different capabilities, and we also produce other tools to help you, I'd say, transform your supply chain and your procurement. And the transformation that we're thinking of is moving towards a network of good rather than low-cost suppliers. So yes, regulatory compliance, yes, helping us with our ability to collaboratively schedule. And this is what we mean by building a digital twin. So the digital twin will have some aspects of authentication and identity. So as we onboard our customers and our suppliers, they choose what they want us to share. By the way, everybody will be in multiple of these communities. I think the idea that you'll just join one and it will have all your suppliers is just not going to work. What we're seeing already is that people belong to at least one network on the buy side and at least another one on the supply side. And what are they doing? They're collectively anticipating demand. So they're pulling in a lot of different data. In the past, when we did S&OP, it was a lot of, let's say, judgment basis. I can remember in the past, we used to kind of get together all the account teams, and the account teams would say, we're going to sell this much this month, and here's our gap fill. If you're going to do that right across a network of collaborating enterprises, you're probably not going to do it by looking them in the eye. And you're going to want to exploit new streams of data. People already exploiting, of course, weather, but why not be looking at all those search engine arguments? That's, after all, what Amazon is doing, and that's how they get to anticipate what people want. So you need to be pulling in all that kind of data and need to be aggregating it. And then you need to be able to collectively manage a schedule. So any of you who've ever worked on production schedule or a transportation schedule, you know the scheduler produces lots and lots of action messages. And if you're the materials planner or materials manager, you've got to respond to those in sequence. What we're seeing is people saying, we need action messages which are not just for our enterprise, but perhaps for our customers, certainly for our suppliers, for our carriers as well. And that we need to get their confirmation that they've received the action message. We need to get their confirmation that they've reflected it in exactly what they do. So that what's my, let's say, progress purchase order becomes your accelerated work order or transportation order. So those, that kind of symmetry is what we're seeing people use platforms for. And these are the platforms that we're researching right now. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at how people do this now, it's a mass of email, sometimes frantic telephone calls, sometimes IMs as well. Actually, that's really hard. It's one of the reasons why people miss all this. If you can put it all together in a single platform, you make it much easier for people to synchronize their effort. And so one of the things that we have is a benchmark of your maturity around this. How do you go around authenticating your partners? How do you synchronize your activity? How do you share and schedule? And it's this that's really driven an enormous uptick in investment in supply chain. So for the last 5-7 years, people have invested really heavily in Salesforce automation, in CRM, in e-commerce, and they're making lots of promises to their customers. But if you want to deliver on the promises, you've got to invest in this kind of supply chain technology too. And that supply chain technology helps to create a smart supply chain, which, yeah, helps you to profit, but it also helps the people and the planet too. So it's anticipating fluctuations in demand and supply and responding to the market that you have, or the model that you have of the market, of the assets that you have, and of inventory. What do you have to do that? We heard a little bit already about coaching colleagues around supplier value. You need to be able to continuously replan that network. So 30 or 40 years ago, when I used to lease those things for 3 years, that isn't going to work. You aren't going to have these fixed relationships. They're going to change. We've heard people talk a lot about data. You've got to be proficient, or make sure your platform is, in using AI to monitor risks, to sustainability and to resilience. You've got to use these supply networks that help you build in options, validate and authenticate your partners. And you might want to look at our maturity assessment. I think you get a copy of these slides. These are the research reports I used to pull this together, and these are my contacts. And thank you very much for listening, and very happy if you have any questions. Though it's hard for me to see you. Perhaps Sean will moderate it.
Thank you, George. I'll just take that off.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Are there any questions from the floor, by the way? I do have a couple of questions here on my iPad. Okay. Right, I'll take one here. Now, George, you've clearly got loads of experience in this field. Does that help to put risk into perspective?
Say again, what?
All your experience.
Yeah, is this unprecedented? Is it the end of the world?
Well, yeah, because clearly, yeah, okay, good. In your own words then.
Yeah, no, not really, no. I can remember 10 years ago we were all going to die of, was it bird flu or swine flu? And actually we made contingencies, everyone would work at home. Well, it didn't kind of happen, but yeah, the risk is opportunity. And there's always risk, there's always something changing. Somebody already said it's not the first pandemic, it's not the first war. So it's part of life. And it's why people, if you're smart, why you build in options. Interestingly, every system I ever integrated had alternate bills of materials or alternate recipes and alternate suppliers. Nobody we talked to during this pandemic invoked those. Why was that? Because they never tested them. And the thing is, somebody said you've got to assume something's going to happen, so you better test these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Daniel who said that, and you're at least the second speaker today who said that risk is an opportunity as well.
I mean, actually, most people have these things embedded in their systems. They also have things like dynamic lead time. Nobody ever uses that. That's really important for handling something like this.
Okay, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But please, George, Lawrie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thanks.
Thank you.